Thank you very much. It's an enormous pleasure to be here in Seoul. It's not a privilege I get very often. I've been here a couple of times before, but this will be my longest stay, and I look forward to exploring some parts of downtown Seoul in the next couple of days. This is joint work with Steph Haggard, my colleague at UC San Diego, and of course a longtime student of the East Asian developmental state and the political processes of transformation in East Asia in particular, but among developing and emerging countries in particular. I'm a specialist on the Chinese economy, and so Steph and I were very pleased to get this invitation, since we saw it as an opportunity to sit together and think through some of the big issues that have been obviously affecting all of us and affecting each of our academic specialties in different ways. So the paper that we wrote really focuses around three different sets of large-scale changes. And so the first of these is the change in the attitude in the United States towards the international order. The second is a large-scale economic change in China as it reaches the end of the period of extraordinarily high growth and transitions to a moderate growth path with less dominance given to the process of export promotion. And the third shift is China's shift to a more dynamic state-led economy and party-led society. And although we're not going to argue a single set of causal relations link those three changes, nonetheless the three changes are clearly very deeply intertwined. And on that basis, we won't try and make any predictions, but we'll at least lay out a few simple scenarios for the future. Let me start out, since Steph wrote the first couple of sentences of this paper, I think I can go ahead and just read them out and quote them. I wouldn't do that for my own words, but what he said I thought here was really well put. He said, for a long time, U.S. foreign economic policy toward China was an integral part of the U.S.'s defense of a liberal, rule-based global economic system. The core to this strategy was the integration of China through the negotiation of binding rules, with China's entry into the WTO as the crowning moment of this approach. This strategy not only united the U.S.'s two political parties on most issues, it also enjoyed support among U.S. allies. However, since 2016, this approach has collapsed. So the change in attitude in the United States, of course, in a proximate sense, this is due to the emergence of Donald Trump as the President of the United States. Donald Trump can be viewed as an aberration. Perhaps he's just an aberration. But he also represents the sense among different elements of the American political economy that the pre-existing orientation towards the global international system was not working, and was not working especially with regard to relations with China. Now, I'm not interested in sort of making an argument about this. I really want to just describe the political configuration in the United States so that we can all incorporate it into our discussion here. It's been true in the United States for a long time that there's a huge difference between the view of elites, and especially policy-making elites, and the views of the people as a whole. Policy-making elites for a long time have been overwhelmingly committed to the idea of a rules-based international order and an open international economic order. Well, among the broader American public, this commitment has been much weaker, much more uncertain, and dispersed among two different political parties. In other words, within both political parties, there were pro-globalization groups and anti-globalization groups for different reasons. So I think we start with this bifurcation between American elite views and American mass views, then we understand it a little bit better. The reason the Trump shock has been so profound is that it operated on both of these levels, right? As a democratic, in terms of the democratic system, Trump was able to put together a coalition very few people expected, where unhappy manual workers, especially in the Middle West, defected from the Democratic Party and joined the Trump coalition. and thus gave him victory in the presidential election, even though the pathway to that was incredibly narrow. But the reason the impact is so great is that among the policymaking classes as well, the feeling had steadily been growing that the strategy to integrate China into the rules-based international order was not working. And so there was a profound growing sense of disillusionment about the relationship with China. Now, of course, when I use these terms, again, I want to be clear that I'm using the terms as they get used in the United States. I'm not saying that the rules-based order was perfect. I'm not saying that the United States was certainly a flawed advocate of a rules-based order, but it was nonetheless an advocate of a rules-based order that it had spent a great deal of time contributing to the construction of. So that's the first big change. Right? Big change in the American configuration of American politics and attitude, which we just don't know how they're going to work out. In my personal view, I believe that after 2020, probably Donald Trump will not be president, and there will be a different configuration, but the parties are going through a realignment of their attitudes. The Democratic Party is actually becoming more free trade, while the Republican Party, which traditionally was free trade, is realigning towards a more protectionist stance. So it's extremely unpredictable from the U.S. standpoint. The second big change then is the change in economic change in China. And we can date these for one of two different turning points. If we're looking especially at international interactions, then 2006 is a very sharp turning point. It's the high point of China's trade ratios. Since 2006, exports and imports as a share of GDP have dropped consistently, and China has reoriented its economic policies to be less of an export promotion system. At the same time, it's also been a transition from very high speed growth, above 10%, to medium speed growth, 6% around, plus or minus, so far above 6%, but lower. And with the shift to medium-paced economic growth, the political economy within China has shifted as well, too. Export interests don't seem as strong. There's been a lot of fluctuation between the kind of influence that the top policymakers give to different business groups and different economic interests. Nothing exemplifies this more than the sort of rise and fall of the four so-called gray rhinoceroses, the large politically linked private companies like Hainan Airlines and all those other companies that were huge external investors for a couple of years in 2015 and 2016, but were then subject to dramatic clampdowns by the political authorities in 2016, from the end of 2016 and onward. So China made this dramatic shift from a miracle growth economy to an immediate post-miracle economy that obviously people in Korea and in a longer stretch of time Japan are very familiar with. It's a shift that changes everything in a sense. It changes the economies, but it changes the domestic political economy, and it typically changes the policy package. Now, before this period, before 2010, American efforts to engage China in the global economic system were generally viewed as being successful. More recently, that has been much less true. But still, this occurred in the context where I think most people anticipated that a deep economic bargain between China and the United States would become more feasible, not less feasible, after this change. Why more feasible? For two reasons. One is the experience of Japan and Korea had clearly indicated that as countries made this transition from very high speed growth to medium speed growth, more sophisticated economies, as they became closer to the global technology frontier, they typically adopted a more light touch approach to industrial policy. As their companies grew stronger, government drew back on its degree of intervention in the economy, and they allowed a relatively more laissez-faire approach to economics that created more economic alliances across borders. And so, if anything, we sort of subconsciously expected that China would follow the same path. But as it turned out, it didn't. And the second reason is, as China slowed down a little bit, China's massive saving rate meant that China had surplus saving available for investing abroad. And of course, China began to emerge as a really substantial outward investor in about 2013. China's outward investment doubled every year for about 4 or 5 years in a row, and by 2015, China was a huge net outward foreign direct investor. And so that, of course, opened up the possibility that new bargains could be made on the basis of reciprocity. And that as China's interest in being an investor and protecting and expanding outward investor rights grew, that China would be open to a new set of bargains. And through 2015, China and the United States were engaged in negotiation of a bilateral investment treaty that we never knew if it would work or not, but there were high hopes really up until the very end. But ultimately, those did not succeed. So the third change then, so in other words, ultimately the opportunity to create a new set of bargains based on China's middle income and maturing economy did not come to fruition. Which means that the third set of changes, which is China's shift to a more state-dominated development strategy and, of course, a more party-dominated society, have played a very fundamental role in the reaction of Americans, and thus the shift in the American attitude toward what kinds of cooperation, what kind of deals are possible with China. How many do we have? 5 minutes. And what we see as a result of this on the U.S. side is, number one, let me list just 4 things that are kind of a direct result of all of these sets, these 3 changes. First is we see a very deep reconsideration going on in the United States about whether China's accession to WTO was successful or not, whether it worked, whether it was a good step. There's a lot of recrimination about this in U.S. circles, but also the feeling that U.S. strategy in some sense was misplaced, in the sense that the U.S. never pushed very hard for China's compliance with its, not just its WTO general regulations, but specifically with China's accession agreement to the WTO, which contains some very significant commitments on the part of China. And the U.S. has never been very happy with the way they worked out, but the feeling was further reform in China, maybe a bilateral investment treaty, were much more important objectives, and so there wasn't much attention paid to that until recently. Second, there's the feeling that China's industrial policy, as it has multiplied in amplitude over the last 5 or 6 years, has fundamentally disrupted the basis of technological cooperation between these two economies. 5 or 6 years ago, China had a modest industrial policy, but today China's putting literally hundreds of billions of dollars into a whole series of high-tech sectors. And so the feeling in the United States, both among American companies and policymakers, is that this threatens the existing sort of understanding about the degree of coordination and competition. Third, a state-coordinated program of external acquisitions caused a lot of controversy in the United States. It was quite clear that the large-scale semiconductor investment fund was being used to fund acquisition of semiconductor companies around the world and in the United States in a way that really got alarm bells ringing in the United States. And finally, this led to deep suspicion about the Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative, of course, on the one hand, it's an infrastructure investment program. Everybody acknowledged that infrastructure investment is essential in Asia. But on the other hand, it's also a statement by the Chinese government that the external flow of outward investment from China is going to be largely shaped or controlled or dominated by the state and shaped into a hub and spoke program, hub and spoke pattern centered around China. And so this again throws into question China's commitment to a broader type of rules-based policy. So where does this leave us? Of course, it leaves us in a period of immense uncertainty because it's really hard to predict U.S. policy as well as, for that matter, Chinese policy. We essentially lay out three simple scenarios. I won't describe them because I'm out of time, but basically it's certainly possible that the Trump administration will draw back from its confrontational policy and settle for a relatively modest set of changes. But we think that's unlikely. It's much more likely that there will be a period of partial decoupling between the two economies, accompanied by a significant amount of long-term friction. There is, of course, a third possibility, which is out and out Cold War. We think right now that's less likely, but a lot of the elements are in place that could cause us to stumble into that. So I better stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. Time? Okay. Thank you.